Alright guys, there is no introduction that would suffice for this. Frankly, I've been thinking about this the entire way back after watching the movie, and this review, more than anything else, feels momentous. Not because it's going to change anyone's life or anything like that, no. But for me, it feels momentous. We made it. We watched Superman. Or I'm presuming we watched Superman. Maybe you haven't seen Superman, and if you haven't, welcome to the Access Blockbusters review, non-spoiler, and then spoiler, for James Gunn's Superman. And the reason this feels momentous is because this is the start of a new universe. Guys, I wasn't watching movies that much when the first Iron Man came out. I barely knew what was going on. I finally caught on when the first Avengers came out, and by that point, the MCU had already been going and was already a success. This is, and even Man of Steel, by the way. I didn't watch Man of Steel in theaters, but I did see Batman v Superman in theaters, and by that point, the DCEU was on its way. This is different. We are at the inception point of a brand new cinematic universe, the DCU, and this is the first film in it. So like I said, this is going to be a non-spoiler and then spoiler review for James Gunn's 2025 Superman. We're going to go into non-spoilers first, and then when I give the clear delineation, so you will have no mistake, you will not mistake when the cutoff is, I will clearly say spoilers ahead, and then we will cut to spoilers. You can save the segment for later if you haven't seen the film and you don't want to be spoiled. So let's dive into Superman, starring David Cornsweet, Rachel Brosnahan, Nicholas Hoult, and many other fun characters. And for non-spoilers, by the way, just to preface this, I won't be spoiling anything that you haven't seen in the trailers, at the very least. And I'm talking about the main trailers. So, for example, Guy Gardner, a Green Lantern, is in the movie, the guy with the bowl cut. That's in every single trailer. You know, those kinds of things I will be talking about in so far as you have seen the trailers. That's about it. Anyways, let's get into the review. So I always like to start out my reviews because I think it's super important to preface anything that I say as somebody who's telling you my opinion about something, about what my expectations were going into the movie and where I was coming from. Because I think, I've always said this, the person who is reviewing, knowing their sensibilities, knowing their expectations, and knowing what they like, what they don't like, and what they were hoping for, I think is just as important as what they actually have to say. So for me, well, based on my YouTube channel, if it's your first time here, welcome. I love comic book movies. I love superhero movies, pop culture, and all that kind of stuff. I'm a big fan of the MCU. I like some of the DCEU films, but more so the auxiliary films like the Batman. I love the Batman. I just love fun movies, comic book movies, superhero movies. I believe in that they have such potential in the entertainment industry. Those people who are like, they're just trash movies and popcorn movies. I love superhero movies. And I know a lot of people have been just over the moon about all the Superman trailers and whatnot. And it's all on the channel. If you want to go back and see my reactions and thoughts on every single main Superman trailer, it's all there. It's all documented. I've liked them, but every single trailer has come with its caveats and hesitations on my part. James Gunn is a very, very talented storyteller. And when he pulls emotion out, he can really pull emotion out. But he also, for me, has been known, especially recently, to go a little bit too far. I think Creature Commandos was okay. And I think Creature Commandos was really James Gunn's R-rated, not goofy, but over-the-top sensibilities put to the max. I like the Suicide Squad. I actually quite like Peacemaker. Those are very different films, though they're very irreverent films. Even Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, when he pulls the emotion out, it is there, and it is strong, and it hits me really hard. But I do think some parts of Guardians of the Galaxy 3, for example, the scene on the couch where Drax is lying on the couch, it's just too much, a little bit over the top for me. So I was nervous. I was a little bit nervous, especially watching the trailers and going, there's a lot of comic bookiness going on. Guy Gardner's bowl cut, Mr. Terrific's mask, that's a tongue twister. Crypto the space dog, and all these different things. There are just things in there that make me go, I don't know. I'm really hoping for the best. And so I walked into Superman, again, really good reviews is what I heard, and really good reactions. I went into Superman with hope. And I liked the movie. Now, it's hard for me because, well, it's not hard for me, but it's difficult for anybody, I should say, to kind of be in this middle ground. Because the vast majority of the people, it seems like, love this movie. And that's amazing. I completely celebrate that. And I hope that everybody who went into Superman wanting to love it, absolutely loved it. I do know also that there are going to be people who just hate the movie. Very small minority, I think, based on the reactions and whatnot. But, we saw that Daily Beast article, that Daily Beast review that leaked a couple days before the embargo lifted. And they're just going to be toxic fans who hate the movie for whatever reason. That is their prerogative, but it's also, we can ignore them. We don't have to listen to them. There are going to be people who hate the movie. I have a feeling, though, that if anybody says, I thought it was okay, that a lot of people are going to raise their eyebrows. And I'm not even there. I don't even think the movie is just okay. I like the movie. I do like the movie. I can't, though, as I was walking back from the theater, I can't bring myself to say I love it. And so let's dive into the reasons why. First of all, let's get into the cast, because I think the cast is really what holds the movie, or what could distinguish the movie, based on how good the cast is. David Gordon Sweat, I like as Superman. And I think that there are key pivotal moments that I found myself thinking, oh my gosh, that is Superman. There are other moments where I felt myself going, this is a character that still needs to grow in his character progression. And that's very intentional, by the way. I don't say that that's not intentional. That is a very intentional thing. James Gunn is specifically putting this version of Superman in a very specific point in his life, in the universe and whatnot. And that's good. That's good and all. But for me, as I'm watching that version of the character, who I do think grows by the end of the movie, I really do. But there are moments in the story where I'm going, yep, that's a version of Superman that we need to kind of get through, and then we'll head on into hopefully some better days. Now I say better days. I don't hate this version of Superman or anything. And again, like I said, there are moments in this movie where the camera is framed on him and he's talking, and I'm like, that is Superman, and I was so bought in. By the way, speaking of camera movements, one of the other things that I thought about a lot as well after the movie is just how competently shot and assuredly made this movie was. In terms of its cinematography, the shot compositions, there are a couple things like the way that he flies. Sometimes you see it in the trailers that James Gunn likes, the really close-up, almost GoPro angle. And that is what it is. And sometimes it works better than others, actually. But there are a couple scenes where I was like, well, yeah, a little too close to Superman. But again, most of the shots that were, the action sequences, the way that the camera is framed, the lighting, everything, all that kind of stuff is it shows me that it's what sets this movie apart, from another director who might have just kind of done generic things with the camera. And I think that's amazing. So I really, the way that they frame Superman throughout the movie is very, very intentional. And like I said, going back to David Gordon Sweat, I think that he, as Clark, is really good. Although, doesn't have a whole lot to do as Clark Kent. But as Superman, I think that there are moments that really show me this is going to be a great Superman. And more than anything else, I cannot wait to see him in the future as Superman. I think that where we leave him off at the end of the movie makes me go, yeah, let's really dive into Superman now. And I think that this is the first film. It's not an origin story like James Gunn has been saying, but it's a film that is exploring still a newer Superman. And I think that we just kind of have to go through the growing pains. Rachel Brosnahan is quite good as Lois Lane. And we all kind of thought she would be. She's quite good. She has, that journalistic streak in her at all times. And I think that there were a couple moments towards the end towards the middle and the end where I was a little bit worried of what are we doing with this character in the movie? But they managed to pull it in a way where at the end you understand what the core of her character is and why she's able to really make an impact in the story in a very specific way. And I really like that. I like their chemistry a lot. I like them a lot together. I like their relationship, actually. I like that, the chemistry aside, I like the way that the relationship was built up and written. And I think that there are a couple scenes where you're going, wow, that's an interesting way to approach that. But I think that the way that, they approach this relationship is a very real, true-to-life relationship. It works. It really does work. And the other third of this group is Nicholas Hoult as Lex Luthor. Now, admittedly, there are a few moments, especially towards the end, where I was like, wow, this is a cartoon. And I don't necessarily mean that as a bad thing, surprisingly. It's odd because there are moments where I'm like, wow, this is really over the top. But it's never in a way where I'm saying, oh, that was terrible. It's just like, yeah, this is just the tone that this scene is embodying. The tones can kind of change scene to scene. But then there are other scenes where he's much more nuanced, I think, and much more grounded. And so I like his portrayal a lot. And I think that when you understand where he's coming from in his opposition to Superman, I think you understand him as a character. Obviously, like any good villain, you don't root for him, and you know that even though he might be justified in his own head, that his actions are indefensible and all those kinds of things, you totally understand that. But there are, I think that as with many good villains, you understand why he's doing what he's doing. And I think that's all you can ask for. And I think obviously Nicholas Hoult, he's a fantastic actor. He did a great job. Speaking of tone, though, let's talk about the tone. So the movie has a very lighthearted tone in comparison to perhaps the other iterations of Superman, Man of Steel. And one thing I was worried about, like I mentioned before, I think James Gunn sometimes can go over the top. Sometimes James Gunn can be too goofy. And you might have heard in my segment we did in last week's episode of the Access Blockbusters Pod where I was saying in my hopes, I hope it doesn't go too goofy. Again, Crypto being one of them. And I have to preface this, I love dogs, but Crypto, a dog with a cape and Superman collar, I don't know. I don't know about that. And to my surprise, the goofiness was absolutely not a problem in this movie. Am I going to say that every single joke landed for me? No, I'm not. There are actually a number of jokes that a couple people around me were chuckling at, and I found myself thinking, it didn't quite land for me. There are a couple that I did laugh out loud. The movie's not trying to be a comedy, though. I think in the way that if you watch Peacemaker Season 1, or if you watch Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 as a couple examples of recent James Gunn projects, you can tell there are moments of, peppered throughout each episode and each minute of the film where you go, oh, you're supposed to laugh at that, and that's a joke, and it's, those are built as comedies with heart underneath that. Superman is not built like that, and I'm very, very relieved about that. This is not a film like Thor: Love and Thunder where every time they try to crack a joke, I'm like, why would we do that? There. It's not like that at all. Again, I'm not saying that this is the funniest movie. I really don't think that the ratio of jokes that landed versus not landing was super high for me in particular, and that's okay. It's not trying to be. There are funny moments, but it's not trying to be. And really, what I appreciate the most about this movie are those moments when it's quieter, those moments when the humanity comes out of these characters. This is a movie that is not afraid to tell you what it's about. And I don't mean that in it beat you over the head of what the theme is or anything like that. Not at all. I think the movie knows exactly when to dial it up and when the characters need to explain and not explain, but more so showcase who they are and why they are the way that they are. And there are a couple really I don't want to say clever, but really interesting framing devices as to why Superman has to figure out who he really is. I think that is what this movie is about, is Superman trying to understand, who am I in this world? And there are a couple really interesting pivot points, moments, right, where throughout the movie where I was captivated. In fact, those were the moments, right? That entire framing of Superman thinking, who am I and who am I going to be? That is the core of the movie to me, and those were the parts that stood out the most, of him trying to figure that out. I think that is the strongest part of the movie. In between all of that, there's a lot of action, and there's a lot of craziness, and I'm not going to lie and say that all of it worked. Some of it didn't really work for me. There's some stuff in the middle in a particular location in the film where I was like, yeah, this is entertaining, but I don't know if I love this or not. But, there's some stuff that happens at the end, and there are just things with the action that's entertaining, right? So, to me, Superman, to wrap up my non-spoiler thoughts, alternates between being entertaining, right? And it's not like I was just hooked on everything that was going on, but just entertained by what was happening, to really hopeful and resonant. And it flickers between the two of those. And so when I walked out of Superman, I said, yeah, I liked it. And I'm excited to see where this iteration of Superman, where this world goes next, because it is a universe. It is a lived-in universe. And there's going to be a lot that happens in this universe, and I'm excited to see how Superman fits into all of that. I'm excited to see how the rest of the DCU fits into all of that, because this is going to grow. And to me, I think that is one of the best things I can say about Superman, is that it's a very good launching pad for what comes next. And I don't mean that in the sense of, oh yeah, Amazing Spider-Man 2, they just spent the entire movie setting up things. There are a couple scenes, admittedly, by the way, in this movie where I was like, that didn't need to be in the movie. It felt like it could have been a post-credit scene. That was just setting up something else. And that's fine. It is what it is. It's not going to ruin the movie or anything like that. But for me, just in general of feeling excited for this universe, because I admittedly did not feel that way after Creature Commandos. I was like, that was just James Gunn doing James Gunn things. And while this movie has James Gunn sensibilities in it, this movie did not feel like it was overpowered by him. And I think that is actually a really good thing. So those were my non-spoiler thoughts for Superman. I liked the movie. I'm not going to be one of those people who say this is the greatest thing that was ever made and invented next to sliced bread. I'm not going to say that this is my favorite comic book movie of all time. And that might be unpopular, but that's just how the movie hit me. So let's dive into the spoiler reviews for the spoiler section of this review. If you haven't seen Superman and you want to avoid spoilers, just make sure to save this segment, save this podcast or video wherever you are listening or watching for later, and then come back once you have. Let's dive into the spoilers final warning. I have a couple nitpicks, I'm not going to lie. And usually I'm not one to nitpick. There are just a couple things in this movie that I wanted to get off my chest here in the spoiler section that I couldn't talk about in the non-spoiler section. So one thing is, I totally get that metahumans have existed in this universe for a long time. totally get that. That's not my gripe. I can totally buy in. I love world building. I can totally buy into the fact that, when Mr. Terrific or Guy Gardner or when the Justice Gang show up, everyone's like, yeah, Justice Gang, and nobody's like, what in the world is that? I can totally buy into that. Why is no one running when there is imminent danger in this movie? I think it's one thing, and again, I'm prefacing all this by saying it's a nitpick, so please bear with me for a couple seconds. We'll talk about more of the fun things later. So when buildings are about to fall, people are just standing around, and I get it that they're not surprised by metahumans, but what happened to self-preservation? There are so many scenes where I was like, the building just lit on fire, the building's about to collapse. Why are we standing? Anyways, that's just a nitpick. I like I said, I like Superman. And there are a couple things that, the other thing that I guess sort of irked me a little bit was the Millie Alcock Supergirl scene. Not because of anything within the scene. I thought that was one of the lines when she says bye to Superman. I'm not going to quote it because, family-friendly podcast. But when she says bye to Superman, I laughed out loud. That was really funny. Not Millie Alcock's performance in general. I actually think it's a very clever little twist that Krypto is her dog, because I was like, oh, that actually makes a lot more sense as to why he acts the way that he does, why perhaps he has a little cape on, because that just doesn't, it feels weird to me. It's still, like, none of those things, like Mr. Terrific's mask or Guy Gardner's bowl cut or whatever, which, by the way, Guy Gardner, I'll admit it, I thought Guy Gardner was going to really take me out of the movie, and he didn't. Nathan Fillion was great, and I can't wait to see him in Lanterns. That's the truth. I'm really happy to say that. But, Millie Alcock's scene, that felt very much like Joker, like Barry Keoghan's Joker in The Batman, where I was like, oh yeah, really interesting, really fun scene to set up what's coming next. But that could have been a post-credit scene, right? And I think that the only reason they probably kept that in as the main credit scene was because people didn't know a Supergirl movie was coming in all likelihood, and James Gunn probably in an effort to, again, I'm not blaming him for this, just kind of pointing out that in an effort to probably promote the next movie in the DCU, he was like, yep, let's kind of poke audiences and be like, hey, Supergirl's here, and look forward to that. So that's my thought on what that was. But there was that. But yeah, I got a couple things right, and in my predictions, and I got a couple things wrong. I think one thing that I got very wrong was Ultraman. And I thought, first of all, I thought that Supergirl herself, going back to Supergirl, was going to be a pivotal part of the ending, and she just showed up for 5 seconds. The Ultraman part irks me also a little bit, and again, this is probably the last thing that I'll say that irked me, and then we'll kind of dive into some fun stuff. But I just irked me a little bit because I was hoping that Ultraman was going to be more than just a goon, and it turns out he is a clone of Superman who just shows up for 10 minutes at the end without his mask on. I don't know. I feel like you could have saved that for another movie or another part of Superman's journey, and it could have been something interesting where he cloned Superman, because that is something very Lex Luthor, right? That's something he does all the time in the comics. But it just felt a little bit strange to just throw that in at the very end without even having a point, because there could have been a big philosophical thing there about how this is a reflection of you and this guy and whatnot. But Lex was just like, this is a dumber version of you, but he's stronger. And I was like, all right. But anyways, yeah, again, the scenes that I really enjoyed and the things that really hooked me, the part about Jor-El, and I always forget what Superman's mom's name is, but Superman's Kryptonite parents, Bradley Cooper, by the way, fun cameo, the message part. And the fact that he really clung to that first half of the message and didn't realize what the second half of the message. And I loved, by the way, that the second half of the message, as far as we know, wasn't doctored. That truly was what the command was from Jor-El, is to conquer and his mom, to rule. And I think that creates such an interesting dichotomy, which pays off in such a beautiful way. The scene with Clark Kent and Pa Kent on the farm is, to me, I think the best scene in the movie. That it's when Pa Kent says, and I'm getting a little emotional just thinking about it, that to me, where he says something to the effect of, we parents can't wrangle in their kids. We just give you the tools to live it out. And he says, I couldn't be prouder of the man you are. That to me, and James Gunn understands this. He knows that that's not just a lucky scene that he got in the middle there with, let's make the audience cry, because the last scene of the movie is Superman calling out to his parents or looking for the parents' videos and seeing his childhood videos in Canada. That is Superman. That is Superman. James Gunn got it. Again, in between all of that, there's the giant kaiju monster, which that fight was fun and fine. There is the stuff in the Pocket universe, which was interesting. Honestly, the stuff with Metamorpho there, where he turns into a giant squid thing, and the baby, that stuff to me was probably some of the weaker stuff in the movie. It just felt a little bit too ridiculous. Like I said, James Gunn did a pretty good job of not going way over the top. I really liked Mr. Terrific. I liked Guy Gardner and Hawkgirl. I liked Metamorpho later on in the movie, actually. I liked Lex. What I really liked about Lex at the very end, too, is the whole philosophy behind Lex Luthor. He's just a human, right? But his nemesis is basically the god of that universe. He's Superman. And I loved how he was using the commands at the very end, almost like he was the one punching Superman with Ultraman at the commands. Because the commands were kind of goofy throughout. I was like, this is way too gamer vibes. I don't know what the point of this is, but the payoff to having Lex basically be the one beating up Superman at the very end, that was great. That was really great. The stuff in the pocket dimension, I will say, a little bit too over the top for me. But again, it's these moments in between. It's that moment when Superman hugs Lois before he flies off and turns himself into the DOJ. And all that stuff is happening in the background in the window, which is a really funny scene, by the way. But that hug where he says, "I love you," that's chemistry. It's beautiful. I thought he was being a little bit more of that naive, like, he needs to grow up a little bit, Superman, which, again, is fine. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just not the version of Superman that I would want to see for the next 20 years, right? When he's doing the interview and he's like, "No, you don't understand." That's, again, it's okay. It's totally okay. But the version of Superman that I think I'm really going to grow to love is there towards the end of the movie. And I really appreciate that. So I could say a whole lot more about this movie. And it's a movie that I wonder if it will grow on me a lot more as time goes on. I don't know. Second acts are hard to nail. And I will say the second act of this movie is probably the weaker part, in my opinion. The first act was a little shaky. It got there, though. By the time they get to the scene with the message, right, where the message is intercepted, that was great. That's when the movie really took off for me. The engineer, she is whatever. Like, I wasn't super memorable in my eyes, but again, I liked the movie. I'm not gonna come out here and say, like I said, this is the best movie I've ever seen, but I'm really hopeful, and that's ironic, right? Because that's what the message of the movie is. It's about hope, and I'm very hopeful for the future of this universe with this character in it. So those are my thoughts on Superman, guys. I'm assuming if you are here, you've seen Superman. What did you think about it? Did you love the movie? I really hope you did. Let me know in the comments down below.